The October wind screamed down from the Continental Divide like the voices of lost souls, driving sheets of freezing rain against the log walls of Cedar Falls' one-room schoolhouse. Emma Sullivan pressed her palms against the frost-covered window, watching as lightning split the darkening sky above Mountain Pine Ridge, illuminating the jagged peaks that loomed over their small Colorado Territory settlement like sleeping giants. The barometric pressure had been dropping all day, and every instinct she'd developed during her first harsh winter in this unforgiving country told her that something far worse than rain was coming down from those mountains. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The children had been restless all afternoon, sensing the approaching storm with the primal awareness that civilization hadn't yet bred out of frontier-raised youngsters. Even 8-year-old Lucy Chen, usually the most attentive of her 15 students, had spent the last hour staring anxiously toward the mountains, where her father worked the dangerous silver claims high above the tree line. Emma had dismissed school early, watching as worried parents hurried their children through the muddy streets toward homes that suddenly seemed far too fragile against the fury building overhead. Now alone in the schoolhouse that served as both her workplace and the gateway to her tiny cabin behind it, Emma felt the isolation that had become her constant companion since arriving in Cedar Falls 6 months ago. Boston seemed like another world now, with its gaslit streets, its predictable seasons, and its society that had suffocated her with expectations and pity after her husband's death from consumption. She had come west seeking freedom and purpose, but had found instead a different kind of cage, one built from suspicion and whispered gossip about the educated widow, who dared to live independently in a place where women were expected to remain under male protection and guidance. The storm building outside mirrored the tempest she felt brewing within the town itself. Tensions had been escalating for weeks, ever since Mayor Robert Caldwell had begun his campaign to rid Cedar Falls of what he called undesirable elements. His targets were clear: the Chinese families who had settled near Silver Creek after completing their railroad contracts, the few remaining Confederate veterans who had drifted west after the war, and anyone else who didn't fit his vision of a proper American settlement. Emma had watched with growing unease as her neighbors nodded along with Caldwell's rhetoric, their fears and prejudices stoked by his promises of prosperity and purity. Emma had arrived in Cedar Falls in the spring of 1885 with little more than her teaching certificate, a small inheritance from her late husband's business dealings, and a determination to forge a life independent of the sympathetic but suffocating embrace of Boston society. The advertisement in the Massachusetts Teacher's Journal had been brief and unpromising. Schoolteacher needed for frontier settlement, modest compensation, suitable accommodations provided. Preference given to unmarried applicants of strong moral character. What it hadn't mentioned was that Cedar Falls sat at an elevation of over 7,000 feet, where the air was thin enough to leave newcomers gasping and the winters were harsh enough to break the spirit of those unprepared for mountain living. The town itself was a study in contradictions, caught between its rough mining camp origins and Mayor Caldwell's aspirations for respectability. Main Street featured a mix of hastily constructed log buildings and more substantial frame structures that spoke to recent prosperity from the silver mines. The Silver Dollar Saloon stood directly across from the Methodist Church, while the general store and post office occupied a building that had once served as the town's first jail. It was a place where Sunday morning hymns competed with Saturday night revelry, where educated discourse was as rare as a warm day in January, and where survival often mattered more than propriety. Emma's appointment had not been universally welcomed. The previous teacher, an elderly man named Jeremiah Potts, had been beloved for his gentle manner and his willingness to overlook the frequent absences of children needed for farm and mining work. Emma, with her normal school training and her insistence on rigorous academic standards, represented change that many parents viewed with Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. With suspicion. Her youth, her education, and most problematic of all, her independence, marked her as an outsider in a community that valued conformity above all else. The schoolhouse itself reflected the town's practical approach to education. Built from lodgepole pine logs chinked with mud and moss, it featured 12 rough-hewn desks arranged in 3 rows, a pot-bellied stove that provided inadequate heat. During the brutal mountain winters, and a collection of battered textbooks that had seen better days in more prosperous schools back east, the teacher's desk was positioned near the single window that faced west toward the mountains, providing Emma with a view that could be either inspiring or ominous, depending on the weather and her mood. Her living quarters consisted of a small cabin attached to the rear of the schoolhouse, connected by a covered walkway that provided some protection during the frequent mountain storms. The cabin contained the basics of frontier living: a narrow bed, a small table and chair, a cooking stove, and shelves for her books and personal belongings. It was Spartan by Boston standards, but represented luxury compared to many frontier accommodations. More importantly, it was hers, free from the well-meaning interference of relatives who believed that a woman of 26 should focus on finding a new husband rather than pursuing independent employment. The children of Cedar Falls had initially greeted their new teacher with the skeptical wariness that frontier-raised youngsters reserved for any adult who hadn't proven their practical worth. Emma's insistence on proper grammar, her requirement that assignments be completed neatly and on time, and her introduction of subjects like geography and literature had initially met with resistance from students accustomed to the informal instruction that had characterized their previous educational experience. However, her fairness, her genuine interest in their individual progress, and her willingness to adapt her methods to frontier realities had gradually won their respect and affection. Lucy Chen had been both her greatest challenge and her most rewarding success. The daughter of Lin Chen, a former railroad worker who now operated a small laundry and dry goods business, Lucy possessed a quick mind and an eagerness to learn that reminded Emma of her own childhood hunger for knowledge. However, the child also faced the daily humiliation of racial prejudice that made her an outcast among many of her classmates. Emma's decision to treat Lucy with the same respect and expectations she showed to every other student had been noticed and criticized by parents who believed that educating Chinese children beyond basic arithmetic and English was both unnecessary and potentially dangerous. The criticism had intensified over the summer when Emma had organized a school exhibition featuring recitations, mathematical demonstrations, and essays by her students. Lucy's essay on the history of Chinese contributions to railroad construction had been both informative and eloquently written, earning praise from the few educated members of the community, while causing grumbling among those who preferred to view the Chinese residents as temporary and unwelcome guests in their valley. Mayor Caldwell had made it clear that he considered Emma's coddling of Oriental children to be inconsistent with the values he wanted Cedar Falls to represent. The mayor himself was a man whose small stature and receding hairline belied the considerable political power he wielded within the community. Robert Caldwell had arrived in Cedar Falls 5 years earlier with enough capital to purchase the largest general store and enough ambition to position himself as the town's primary spokesman for progress and prosperity. His vision for Cedar Falls involved attracting the right kind of settlers, while discouraging those whose presence might interfere with his plans for respectability and growth. In practice, this meant supporting the interests of established white families while making life increasingly difficult for minorities and anyone who challenged his authority. Sheriff Henry Walsh served as Caldwell's primary enforcer, a role that suited his temperament perfectly. A large man with hands scarred from years of manual labor before pinning on a badge, Walsh had found in law enforcement a socially acceptable outlet for his inclination toward violence. His interpretation of maintaining order tended to favor those with influence while ensuring that troublemakers and undesirables understood their place in the community hierarchy. Emma had witnessed enough of Walsh's peacekeeping methods to understand that justice in Cedar Falls was often more about maintaining power structures than protecting the innocent. The town's other authority figures presented their own challenges to Emma's position. Reverend Thomas Whitfield, who served as both Methodist minister and head of the school board, was a well-meaning man whose good intentions were often undermined by his unwillingness to challenge popular prejudices. Dr. Franklin Pierce, the town's elderly physician, possessed both the medical skills and moral authority to influence community opinion, but his advancing age and increasing reliance on alcohol made him an unreliable ally for progressive causes. Martha Jenkins, who operated the post office and telegraph station from within her husband's general store, wielded considerable informal power through her position at the center of the town's communication network, but she used that influence primarily to spread gossip rather than promote understanding. Among this collection of community leaders, Emma had found few allies for her belief that education should be available to all children, regardless of their family's social standing or ethnic background. Her insistence on treating every student with equal respect and her refusal to lower academic standards for children from less privileged families had gradually isolated her from many of the parents whose support she needed to maintain her position. The loneliness of her situation was compounded by the absence of other unmarried women her age, leaving her without the female friendships that might have provided both companionship and protection against the social pressures she faced daily. It was into this atmosphere of growing tension and isolation that rumors about the mountain man had begun to circulate with increasing frequency. Daniel Morrison, known to most townspeople simply as Bear, had lived as a hermit in the high country for nearly 8 years, appearing in Cedar Falls only occasionally to trade furs and game meat for supplies. His infrequent visits to town were marked by an almost palpable unease among the residents, who whispered about his massive frame, his war-scarred face, and his unsettling habit of conducting his business in silence before disappearing back into the mountains as suddenly as he had appeared. The stories about Bear varied depending on who was telling them and how many drinks had been consumed before the telling began. Some claimed he had been driven mad by his experiences as a Union Army medic during the war, unable to bear the company of civilized people after witnessing too much death and suffering on Civil War battlefields. Others insisted he was a dangerous criminal hiding from justice in the remote wilderness where law enforcement could never find him. The most dramatic versions painted him as a savage who had abandoned all pretense of civilization, living like a wild animal and posing a constant threat to anyone unfortunate enough to encounter him alone in the mountains. Mayor Caldwell had been particularly effective at spreading and embellishing these stories, using Bear's presence in the area as another example of the undesirable elements that threatened Cedar Falls' reputation and security. According to Caldwell's version of events, Bear had once threatened to kill Jake Mitchell, one of the town's more prominent citizens, during a dispute over a horse. The details of this confrontation grew more sinister with each retelling, transforming what may have been a disagreement between two men into evidence of Bear's dangerous instability and potential for violence. Jake Mitchell himself was a man whose reputation for quick temper and cruel treatment of both animals and people made him an unlikely victim deserving of sympathy, but his status as one of Mayor Caldwell's supporters ensured that his version of events received official credence. Mitchell operated a freight business that connected Cedar Falls with larger settlements down the mountain, and his political support was valuable enough to Mayor Caldwell that any threats to Mitchell's person or property were treated as threats to the entire community's welfare. The only person in Cedar Falls who seemed willing to speak positively about Bear was Old Pete, a grizzled prospector who had known the mountain man since his early days in the high country. Pete's stories painted a very different picture of Daniel Morrison, a quiet, thoughtful man who had sought solitude not from madness or criminality, but from a deep weariness with human cruelty and conflict. According to Pete, Bear possessed both the skills and knowledge necessary to survive in some of the most challenging terrain in the Colorado Territory, and had on several occasions provided aid to travelers and prospectors who found themselves in dangerous situations far from help. However, Pete's advanced age, his reputation for heavy drinking, and his own status as something of an outcast made his testimony easy to dismiss by those who preferred more dramatic explanations for Bear's behavior. The old prospector's claims that the mountain man was actually a gentle soul who preferred the company of wildlife to humans were seen as the ramblings of a man whose mind had been addled by too many years of isolation and too much whiskey. Emma had listened to these competing narratives with the skepticism of someone trained to evaluate evidence and seek truth beyond popular opinion. Her education had taught her to question assumptions and to recognize how fear and prejudice could distort perception, creating monsters where none actually existed. The descriptions of Bear's appearance and behavior reminded her of veterans she had encountered in Boston, men whose experiences during the war had left them struggling to readjust to civilian life and social interaction. If the mountain man was indeed a former Army medic, as some stories suggested, his preference for solitude might represent not madness, but a rational response to trauma that required healing rather than condemnation. These thoughts had remained largely academic until the evening when Emma encountered clear evidence that someone had been watching over the schoolhouse and her cabin during the long mountain nights. Tracks in the snow around her property, carefully arranged firewood that she hadn't split herself, and the absence of the mountain lions and bears that had troubled other isolated homesteads suggested that someone was providing protection that she hadn't requested but apparently needed. The tracks were large enough to belong to a man of considerable size, and they appeared with enough regularity to indicate ongoing surveillance rather than casual observation. Rather than feeling frightened by this discovery, Emma found herself oddly comforted by the thought that someone was concerned enough about her welfare to provide anonymous protection. The realization that her unknown guardian was likely the same man the townspeople feared as a dangerous savage created a cognitive dissonance that forced her to question everything she had been told about the mountain man's character and motivations. If Bear was truly as violent and unstable as the stories claimed, why would he go to such lengths to ensure her safety without ever revealing himself or making any demands for gratitude or compensation? This mystery had been occupying Emma's thoughts with increasing frequency as autumn progressed, and the first serious storms of winter began building in the high peaks. Tonight, as she watched lightning illuminate the mountains and felt the schoolhouse shudder under the assault of wind and rain, she found herself wondering whether the storm would bring her mysterious protector down from his high country refuge, or drive him even deeper into the wilderness where neither weather nor human judgment could touch him. The immediate concern, however, was not the mountain man's whereabouts, but the safety of her students and their families as the storm intensified beyond anything she had experienced during her months in Cedar Falls. The wind was now strong enough to rattle the heavy log construction of the schoolhouse, and the rain had turned to sleet that struck the windows with the sound of thrown gravel. This was the kind of weather that could trap travelers in the open, flood the creeks and arroyos that crisscrossed the valley floor, and turn familiar trails into death traps for anyone caught away from shelter. As if summoned by her thoughts, a frantic pounding on the schoolhouse door cut through the sound of wind and sleet. Emma hurried to open it, finding Martha Jenkins standing on the threshold with water streaming from her heavy coat and terror in her eyes. The normally composed postmistress was breathing hard, as if she had run through the storm from the town center, and her usual air of self-important authority had been replaced by the kind of raw fear that Emma had never seen in the older woman's face. Miss Sullivan, Martha gasped, struggling to catch her breath while rain continued to lash the doorway behind her. You have to help us. Little Lucy Chen is missing. She never made it home from school, and with this storm. Her voice trailed off as the implications hung in the air between them, like the scent of approaching catastrophe. Emma felt her heart stop as the full horror of the situation struck her. Lucy, the brightest and most vulnerable of her students, was somewhere out in the mountains during what was rapidly becoming the most dangerous storm of the season. The 8-year-old girl, who weighed less than 60 pounds and possessed none of the survival skills necessary for mountain weather, was facing conditions that could kill experienced outdoorsmen within hours of exposure. When was she last seen? Emma asked, her teacher's training taking over as she fought to remain calm despite the panic rising in her chest. Her father expected her home by 4 o'clock, Martha replied, glancing at the schoolhouse clock that showed nearly 7. When? She didn't arrive, he came looking, but no one has seen her since school ended. The men are organizing search parties, but with this weather. Again, her voice faded as the impossibility of the situation became clear. Emma's mind raced through the possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Lucy was small enough to seek shelter in places that might protect her from the worst of the storm, but she was also inexperienced enough to make the kind of mistakes that turn survival situations into tragedies. The mountains around Cedar Falls were riddled with abandoned mine shafts, unstable rock formations, and steep ravines that became torrents during heavy rain. A child alone in such terrain, especially during a storm of this magnitude, faced odds that no amount of courage or intelligence could overcome. What are the search parties planning? Emma asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Martha's expression confirmed her fears. Sheriff Walsh is coordinating the effort, but he says it's too dangerous to send men up into the high country during the storm. They're concentrating on the valley floor and the lower trails, hoping she took shelter somewhere close to town. The strategy made sense from a practical standpoint, but Emma understood its fatal flaw. Lucy was not the kind of child to remain close to town when frightened or confused. Her independent spirit and her familiarity with the mountains from accompanying her father to his mining claims made it far more likely that she had sought refuge in the high country, where the search parties were unwilling to venture. If the townspeople limited their efforts to the safe, accessible areas near Cedar Falls, they would be looking in all the wrong places while the child faced the storm alone in terrain that could kill her before dawn. They're excluding her father from the search, Martha continued, and Emma heard the shame in her voice even through the sound of wind and rain. Sheriff Walsh says the Chinese can't be trusted to follow orders during an emergency, and Mayor Caldwell agrees that having Lin Chun in the search party would just create confusion and slow down the effort. The casual cruelty of this decision struck Emma like a physical blow. Lin Chun, who knew the mountains better than most of the townspeople, and who had more motivation than anyone else to find his daughter, was being excluded from the search, based on nothing more than racial prejudice disguised as practical concerns. The same fear and hatred that had made Lucy's life difficult in school was now potentially condemning her to death in the mountains, while her father was forced to remain helplessly in town. Emma made her decision with the clarity that comes when moral imperatives override practical considerations. "I'm going to search for her," she announced, moving toward the hooks where her heavy coat and winter gear hung ready for mountain weather. Martha's eyes widened in shock. "Miss Sullivan, you can't be serious. It's nearly dark, the storm is getting worse, and you don't know the mountain trails well enough to search safely. You'll just become another person who needs rescuing." The objection was reasonable and probably accurate, but Emma had moved beyond reasonable responses to a situation that demanded extraordinary action. "Someone has to look for her in the places where she's most likely to be," she replied, pulling on her heaviest boots and checking the supplies in her emergency pack. If the official search parties won't go into the high country, then I'll have to go alone. You'll die up there, Martha said bluntly. This isn't Boston, Miss Sullivan. These mountains kill people who know what they're doing. A schoolteacher from back east won't last an hour in country like that during a storm like this. Emma paused in her preparations, recognizing the truth in Martha's assessment while refusing to accept its implications. She was indeed poorly equipped for mountain rescue work, lacking both the experience and the physical conditioning necessary for such a dangerous undertaking. However, she also possessed something that the official search parties lacked: the certainty that conventional approaches would fail while a child's life hung in the balance. Then I need help from someone who does know the mountains, Emma said, the solution crystallizing in her mind even as she spoke the words aloud. I need to find Bear. The suggestion struck Martha like a thunderbolt, her face cycling through expressions of shock, horror, and disbelief before settling on the kind of grim determination that frontier women developed when confronted with impossible choices. Miss Sullivan, you're talking about seeking help from a man that half the town believes is dangerous, possibly insane, and definitely unpredictable. Even if you could find him in this storm, what makes you think he would help rather than? She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air between them. Emma met Martha's gaze steadily, drawing on reserves of conviction she hadn't known she possessed. Because someone has been watching over me all these months, making sure I'm safe, protecting me without asking for anything in return. If that someone is Bear, then he's already proven that he cares about protecting people who need help. And right now, Lucy Chen needs help more than anyone has ever needed anything. The logic was sound, but it required a leap of faith that challenged everything the townspeople believed about the mountain man's character and motivations. Emma was essentially betting Lucy's life and her own on the hope that popular opinion was wrong, and that the man everyone feared as a monster was actually the protector she believed him to be. Martha stared at her for a long moment, processing the implications of what Emma was proposing. Finally, she nodded slowly, her expression grim but resolute. If you're determined to do this, at least let me help you prepare properly. And Miss Sullivan, if you find that child alive, it will prove something about both you and that mountain man that this town needs to learn. As Emma gathered her supplies and prepared to venture into the storm-lashed mountains in search of both a missing child and a man the world believed to be dangerous, she realized that she was about to discover whether her faith in human nature could survive the ultimate test. The night ahead would either vindicate her belief that courage and compassion could triumph over fear and prejudice, or it would become a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting instinct over popular wisdom. The storm continued to build outside, but Emma Sullivan had made her choice. In a few minutes, she would step into the darkness and begin the most important journey of her life. Emma stepped out into the fury of the October storm, feeling the full force of mountain weather strike her like a living thing intent on driving her back to safety. The wind grabbed at her heavy wool coat with invisible claws, while sleet stung her exposed face like thrown needles. Within seconds of leaving the schoolhouse, she understood why the official search parties had declared the high country too dangerous for rescue operations. This was weather that could disorient experienced mountaineers and kill the unprepared with ruthless efficiency. Yet as she bent her head against the driving precipitation and began making her way toward the trail that led up Mountain Pine Ridge, Emma felt an odd sense of rightness about her decision. Every instinct developed during her months in Cedar Falls told her that Lucy Chen was somewhere up in those storm-swept peaks, probably sheltering in one of the abandoned mine shafts or natural caves that dotted the landscape above the tree line. The search parties combing the valley floor were looking in safe places, but safety had never been Lucy's primary concern when faced with trouble or confusion. The child possessed the kind of independent spirit that had made her both Emma's most rewarding student and her greatest worry. Lucy had inherited her father's practical intelligence and her late mother's quiet determination, creating a combination that served her well in academic pursuits, but sometimes led to dangerous situations when applied to frontier survival. Emma remembered countless afternoons when Lucy had arrived at school with stories of exploring abandoned claim sites, following deer trails into unfamiliar territory, or investigating geological formations that had caught her scientific curiosity. Lucy Chen had shared his daughter's adventurous nature during their few conversations, describing weekend expeditions to his mining claims where Lucy served as both companion and assistant. The girl had developed an impressive knowledge of mountain geography, learning to read weather signs, identify edible plants, and navigate by landmarks that would be invisible to most adults. This knowledge made her more likely to survive if she found adequate shelter, but it also meant she could have traveled much farther from town than anyone else was willing to acknowledge. The trail up Mountain Pine Ridge began deceptively gently, winding through stands of pine and aspen that provided some protection from the wind. Emma had hiked this route several times during the summer months, drawn by the spectacular views and the solitude that reminded her of childhood walks through the forests of her Massachusetts home. However, the familiar landscape had been transformed by the storm into something alien and threatening, where every shadow could hide a precipice and every sound might signal falling rock or shifting snow. As she climbed higher, the vegetation began to thin and the terrain became increasingly treacherous. The trail, clearly marked during fair weather, disappeared beneath accumulating sleet and snow, forcing Emma to navigate by memory and instinct through country that seemed determined to confuse and misdirect her. More than once, she found herself following what appeared to be a clear path only to discover that she had been led toward a dead end or a dangerous drop-off that would have been fatal in the darkness. The storm's intensity continued to increase as elevation carried her above the protection of the valley floor. Wind speeds that had been merely uncomfortable at the schoolhouse became dangerous at 8,000 feet, where exposed ridges channeled the mountain fury into concentrated blasts capable of knocking an unprepared hiker off balance. Emma found herself moving from tree to tree, using the scattered pines as both navigation aids and windbreaks, while she struggled to maintain her bearings in the chaotic conditions. It was during one of these sheltered pauses, pressed against the trunk of an ancient pine while she caught her breath and tried to warm her numbing fingers, that Emma first became aware she was not alone on the mountain. The realization came not through sight or sound, both of which were nearly useless in the storm, but through a subtle change in the quality of her surroundings that spoke to instincts she hadn't known she possessed. Someone was watching her. The certainty settled over Emma like a physical presence, bringing with it a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. Her unknown observer could be anyone, from a concerned townsperson who had followed her up the mountain to a dangerous stranger, whose intentions remained unclear. However, given the remoteness of their location and the severity of the weather, the most likely explanation was that she had finally encountered the man she had come seeking. Bear Morrison's reputation for moving through the mountains like a ghost suddenly seemed less like folklore and more like practical necessity. If he had indeed been watching over her during the past months, providing anonymous protection and assistance, then his ability to appear and disappear without detection represented skills that could mean the difference between life and death for Lucy Chen. Emma found herself hoping desperately that the presence she sensed belonged to the loomed mountain man rather than to someone with less benevolent intentions. The watching continued for nearly 10 minutes while Emma remained motionless against the pine tree, trying to project calm acceptance rather than fear or aggression. She understood instinctively that any sudden movement or sign of panic might cause her observer to disappear back into the storm, taking with him her only hope of finding Lucy before the weather made rescue impossible. Finally, when her patience was rewarded by the soft sound of snow crunching under careful footsteps, She turned slowly toward the source of the noise. The figure that emerged from the swirling snow seemed to materialize from the mountain itself. So perfectly did his appearance blend with the harsh environment that had shaped his life for the past 8 years. Daniel Morrison was indeed a large man, standing well over 6 feet with the broad shoulders and muscled frame that came from years of physical labor in challenging conditions. However, the scars that marked his face spoke not of violence or cruelty, but of suffering endured and overcome through quiet determination. His eyes, visible beneath the brim of a hat that had been crafted from animal hide, held the watchful intelligence that Emma had expected, but also a depth of compassion that contradicted every story she had heard about his dangerous nature. This was not the face of a madman or a savage, but of someone who had seen too much pain and chosen solitude as a path toward healing rather than revenge. The gentleness in his expression as he studied her storm-battered appearance told Emma everything she needed to know about his character and intentions. "You shouldn't be up here," Bear said finally, his voice carrying the careful cadence of someone who rarely engaged in conversation but retained the ability to communicate when necessary. "This storm will get worse before it gets better, and these trails aren't safe for someone without mountain experience." The concern in his tone confirmed Emma's growing conviction that the townspeople's fears were based on ignorance rather than evidence. Bear Morrison was speaking to her with the same protective instinct that might motivate a father worried about his daughter's safety, not with the threatening manner of someone who posed a danger to innocent people. "A child is missing," Emma replied, raising her voice to be heard above the wind while trying to convey both urgency and respect. "Lucy Chen, one of my students. She's been lost in the mountains since this afternoon, and the search parties won't look in the high country because of the storm." Bear's expression shifted immediately, the casual concern in his features deepening into something more focused and determined. Emma realized that she had just provided information that transformed their encounter from a chance meeting into something approaching a rescue operation. The mountain man's knowledge of the terrain above them, combined with his obvious skills as a tracker and survivalist, represented Lucy's best hope for survival. "The Chinese girl," Bear said, and Emma detected both recognition and respect in his voice. "I've seen her with her father up at the claims. Smart child, knows the country better than most adults, but this weather could kill anyone caught without proper shelter." He paused, studying Emma's face with the intensity of someone making a crucial decision. "You think she went up instead of down when the storm hit?" Emma nodded emphatically, relieved that Bear understood Lucy's probable reasoning. Without lengthy explanation, "She's not the kind of child who would wait passively for help. If she was frightened or confused, she would have looked for the kind of shelter she's seen during her trips with her father. The mine shafts and caves up here would seem safer to her than anything she could find in the valley." "You're probably right," Bear agreed, his manner becoming more businesslike as he mentally cataloged the search area and the challenges they would face. "There are a dozen places within a 2-mile radius where she might have taken shelter, but checking them all in this weather will take time we might not have. If she's injured or if her shelter isn't adequate, exposure could kill her before dawn." The stark assessment sent a chill through Emma that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. Lucy had been missing for more than 3 hours already, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Even if they located her quickly, the return journey to town would be treacherous enough to pose additional risks to both the child and her rescuers. "I can guide you to the most likely spots," Bear continued, apparently having decided that Emma's presence was a fact to be accepted rather than a problem to be solved. "But you need to understand that what we're attempting is dangerous for everyone involved. These mountains don't forgive mistakes, and this storm makes everything 10 times more difficult." Emma felt a surge of gratitude that nearly overwhelmed her ability to respond coherently. The man that her neighbors feared as a dangerous savage was not only willing to help search for a missing child, but was doing so with a level of expertise and calm professionalism that none of the townspeople could have provided. His offer to guide her represented exactly the kind of assistance she had hoped to find, delivered with a matter-of-fact competence that suggested such rescues were simply part of his natural responsibility to protect those who needed help. "Thank you," she managed to say, the words feeling inadequate to express her relief and appreciation. "I know this is asking a great deal, especially considering how the townspeople have treated you, but Lucy doesn't deserve to die because of adult prejudices and fears." Bear's scarred features showed what might have been surprise at her reference to his relationship with the community, followed by something that could have been the beginning of a smile. "The townspeople have their reasons for wanting to avoid me," he said with a philosophical acceptance that spoke of long experience with human judgment. "Most of those reasons are wrong, but fear makes people see what they expect to see rather than what's actually there." The observation contained a wisdom that Emma recognized from her own struggles with community acceptance. Her education, her independence, and her unwillingness to conform to local expectations had marked her as dangerous in much the same way that Bear's appearance and chosen lifestyle had made him a target for suspicion and rumor. They were both outsiders whose very existence challenged the comfortable assumptions that allowed the townspeople to feel safe and superior. "I've been watching over you," Bear continued, confirming what Emma had suspected about her anonymous protector. "Not because you needed protection, but because you were willing to treat that Chinese girl with the same respect you showed to every other child. That kind of courage is rare enough to be worth protecting." The admission that her teaching methods had been observed and approved by someone whose opinion she had come to value sent a warmth through Emma that had nothing to do with physical temperature. Bear's endorsement of her approach to education carried more weight than all the official praise she had received from school board members, who were more concerned with maintaining social order than with actual learning. "Lucy is a remarkable student," Emma replied, following Bear as he began moving up the mountain with the fluid efficiency of someone completely at home in harsh terrain. "She deserves every opportunity to develop her abilities, regardless of what some people think." About her family's background, Bear nodded approvingly while maintaining the steady pace that carried them higher into the storm. "Her father is a good man. Lin Chun knows these mountains as well as anyone, and he's taught his daughter to respect the country without fearing. If she found adequate shelter, she has the knowledge and determination to survive until we can reach her." The confidence in Bear's assessment helped calm some of Emma's worst fears about Lucy's situation. If the mountain man believed that the child possessed survival skills adequate to the current crisis, then the search was not necessarily a futile gesture, but a race against time with reasonable odds of success. They climbed in relative silence. For the next 20 minutes, Bear setting a pace that challenged Emma's physical conditioning without exceeding her capabilities. His route choices demonstrated an intimate familiarity with the terrain that allowed him to find secure footing and avoid the worst of the wind exposure even during the chaotic conditions created by the storm. Emma began to understand how he had earned his reputation for appearing and disappearing like a ghost. His movement through the mountains was so fluid and efficient that he seemed to become part of the landscape itself. The first potential shelter site was an abandoned mine shaft that had been worked extensively during the early days of silver prospecting in the area. The entrance, partially concealed behind a screen of wind-twisted pines, opened into a tunnel that extended several hundred feet into the mountain before branching into multiple galleries. Bear approached the opening with the caution of someone who understood both the protection such places could provide and the dangers they might conceal. "Lucy," Emma called into the darkness, her voice echoing off stone walls as it penetrated the depths of the abandoned workings. "Lucy, if you're in there, please answer. It's Miss Sullivan, and I've brought help." The response came not as words, but as a sound that made Emma's heart leap with relief and renewed fear. From somewhere deep within the mine came the unmistakable Noise of falling rock, followed by a thin cry that could only have been produced by a frightened child. Lucy was indeed sheltering in the mine, but something was preventing her from answering normally or coming to the entrance. Bear moved into the tunnel without hesitation, producing a lantern from his pack and lighting it with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to working in dangerous underground spaces. "Stay close behind me," he instructed Emma, "and don't touch anything unless I tell you it's safe. These old workings are unstable, and the wrong step could bring down enough rock to bury us all." The tunnel system proved to be more extensive than Emma had imagined, with multiple branches leading off into darkness that their single lantern could not penetrate. Bear navigated the maze with the confidence of someone who had explored these workings before, following subtle signs that would have been invisible to less experienced eyes. The sound of dripping water echoed from unseen chambers, while occasional air currents suggested openings to the surface that might provide either escape routes or additional hazards, depending on their location and accessibility. They found Lucy in a side chamber approximately 200 feet from the main entrance, huddled against a wall where fallen timber had created a small pocket of protection from rockfall. The child was conscious and apparently uninjured, but her face showed the strain of hours spent listening to the storm outside while worrying that her chosen refuge might become her tomb. Her relief at seeing familiar faces was evident, despite her obvious exhaustion and fear. "Miss Sullivan," Lucy whispered, her voice hoarse from calling for help that hadn't come until now. "I was following the trail to Papa's claim when the storm got bad. I thought this would be safe, but rocks started falling when the thunder got loud, and now I can't get past them to reach the entrance." Emma's examination of Lucy's situation confirmed the child's assessment of her predicament. A rockfall triggered by the thunder that accompanied the storm had partially blocked the chamber's only exit, creating an opening that was too small and unstable for safe passage. Lucy had been trapped not by injury or disorientation, but by the mountain's response to the atmospheric disturbance raging above them. Bear studied the rockfall with the methodical attention of someone calculating both risks and possibilities. "The good news is that most of this debris is loose material that can be moved safely if we work carefully," he told them after completing his assessment. "The bad news is that clearing enough space for passage will take time, and we need to be out of here before the storm gets any worse." Emma watched as the mountain man began the delicate process of removing stones from the pile that blocked their escape route. His movements were deliberate and controlled, each rock carefully evaluated before being shifted to ensure that its removal wouldn't trigger a larger collapse. The work was physically demanding and mentally exhausting, requiring constant vigilance against the possibility that one wrong move could trap all three of them in the underground chamber. Lucy, despite her ordeal, proved to be an invaluable assistant in the clearing operation. Her small size allowed her to reach stones that were inaccessible to the adults, while her intelligence enabled her to understand Bear's instructions about which pieces could be moved safely and which needed to remain in place to maintain structural stability. Emma found herself impressed once again by the child's resilience and practical problem-solving abilities. "You know," Lucy said during a brief rest in their labors, addressing Bear with the directness that characterized all her interactions, "with adults, Papa told me you were dangerous, but you don't seem dangerous to me. You seem like someone who knows how to help people when they need it." Bear's scarred features showed what was unmistakably a smile at Lucy's assessment. "Your Papa is a wise man who wants to protect you from anything that might cause harm," he replied gently. "Sometimes that means being careful around people you don't understand, even if they're not actually dangerous. Miss Sullivan isn't dangerous either." Lucy continued with the logic of childhood that often cut through adult complications with startling clarity. "But some people in town act like she is because she's different from what they expect. Maybe being different isn't the same as being dangerous." The observation struck Emma as profoundly wise, capturing in a few simple sentences the dynamic that had made both her and Bear targets for community suspicion, despite their actual characters and intentions. Lucy's ability to see past surface differences to underlying humanity represented exactly the kind of wisdom that Emma had been trying to nurture in all her students. Bear nodded approvingly at Lucy's conclusion while continuing his careful work on the rockfall. Difference makes some people uncomfortable because it challenges their assumptions about how the world should work, he agreed. But difference also makes the world more interesting and often more helpful when problems arise that require new solutions. The conversation continued as they worked, creating an atmosphere of companionship that helped offset the stress and physical demands of their situation. Emma found herself learning about Bear's background through casual references that painted a picture very different from the stories circulated in town. His medical training during the war had indeed left him with skills that proved invaluable in frontier conditions, but it had also exposed him to enough human suffering to make him value peace in solitude above the social interactions that most people took for granted. "I came to the mountains because they don't judge," Bear explained when Lucy asked why he preferred living alone to remaining in town. "Trees and rocks and wildlife accept you based on your actions rather than your appearance or your history. After spending 4 years watching young men die from diseases and wounds that proper medical care could have prevented, I needed to be around something that wasn't constantly reminding me of human cruelty and waste." Emma understood the appeal of such an environment, having experienced her own version of social judgment that made solitude seem preferable to constant evaluation by people who valued conformity over authenticity. But Bear's choice to retreat from civilization represented not cowardice or antisocial behavior, but a rational response to experiences that had challenged his faith in human nature's fundamental goodness. The clearing work progressed steadily despite the challenging conditions, with each removed stone bringing them closer to an opening large enough for safe passage. Bear's expertise proved invaluable in determining which pieces of debris could be safely relocated and which needed to remain in place to prevent further collapse. His patient, methodical approach to the dangerous task demonstrated the kind of practical competence that had enabled his survival in the harsh mountain environment. As they worked, the storm outside continued to rage with undiminished fury, its sounds penetrating the mind through cracks and openings that spoke to the underground system's connection with the surface world. The temperature in their chamber remained relatively stable, protected as they were from wind and precipitation. But Emma knew that their return journey would expose them once again to conditions that were becoming increasingly dangerous as the night progressed. "How much farther to town once we get out of here?" Emma asked, beginning to worry about their ability to navigate the treacherous mountain trails in darkness and storm conditions that had worsened significantly since their arrival at the mine. Bear paused in his work to consider their options, his expression suggesting that he was weighing multiple factors beyond simple distance. "Under normal conditions, about an hour back to the schoolhouse," he replied. "But with this storm and the trail conditions, probably twice that long, assuming we can maintain our footing and direction in the dark." The prospect of a 2-hour journey through storm-lashed mountains with an exhausted child filled Emma with renewed anxiety about their chances of reaching safety without additional incidents. Lucy was showing signs of fatigue that suggested her reserve of energy were nearly depleted, while Emma herself was beginning to feel the physical and emotional strain of the rescue operation. Only Bear seemed unaffected by the challenging conditions, his movements remaining steady and controlled despite the demands of the clearing work. "There's another option," Bear continued after a moment's consideration. "My cabin is only about 30 minutes from here, following trails that are more protected from the wind. We could shelter there tonight and return to town in the morning when the weather improves and visibility is better." The suggestion made practical sense, but Emma immediately understood its social implications. Spending the night in the mountain Man's cabin, even under emergency circumstances, would provide Mayor Caldwell and his supporters with exactly the kind of ammunition they needed to destroy her reputation and remove her from her teaching position. The fact that Lucy would serve as a witness to the innocent nature of their arrangement might not be sufficient to counter the scandal that would inevitably follow such an unconventional situation. However, as another rumble of thunder shook the mine and caused additional debris to shift ominously in the passage they were clearing, Emma realized that social considerations had become secondary to survival concerns. The storm was continuing to intensify rather than showing signs of abatement, and attempting to navigate the dangerous mountain trails with an exhausted child during conditions that challenged even Bear's considerable skills might represent a greater risk than facing the social consequences of an overnight stay in his cabin. "If you think it's safer than trying to reach town tonight," Emma said finally, "then that's what we should do. Lucy's welfare is more important than what people might say about our decision." Bear nodded approvingly at her priorities while lifting away another section of the rockfall that had been blocking their passage. "In the mountains, you make decisions based on survival first and social concerns second," he agreed. "The people who criticize those choices are usually the ones who have never faced situations where the wrong decision means death for everyone involved." Lucy, who had been listening to this exchange with the attentiveness that characterized her approach to adult conversations, looked up from her position near the debris pile with an expression of curiosity rather than concern. "Will your cabin be warm?" she asked Bear with the practical directness of a child whose primary worry was physical comfort rather than social complications. "Warm, dry, and stocked with enough food to keep us fed until the storm passes," Bear assured her. "I built it to provide shelter during the worst weather these mountains can produce, so it should feel quite comfortable compared to where we are now." The promise of warmth and safety gave Emma the additional motivation she needed to complete their escape from the mine. Working together with renewed energy, the three of them managed to clear enough debris to create an opening that would allow safe passage back to the main tunnel and eventually to the surface. The work had taken nearly an hour, but it had also created bonds of cooperation and trust that Emma knew would influence all their future interactions. As they prepared to leave the mine and begin the journey to Bear's cabin, Emma reflected on how drastically her understanding of both the mountain man and her own capabilities had changed during the course of their underground ordeal. The man she had been taught to fear had proven to be not only harmless but invaluable, demonstrating exactly the kind of competence and compassion that the situation required. Meanwhile, she had discovered reserves of physical and emotional strength that she hadn't known she possessed, enabling her to contribute meaningfully to a rescue operation that would have been impossible without cooperation between all three participants. The storm that had driven them together had also revealed fundamental truths about character and courage that would reshape Emma's perspective on both her place in the Cedar Falls community and her relationship with the mysterious protector who had been watching over her from the mountain heights. As they emerged from the mine into the fury of the October night, she knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again, regardless of how their adventure ultimately concluded. The journey to Bear's cabin through the storm-ravaged mountain landscape proved to be every bit as challenging as Emma had anticipated, despite following what Bear assured them were the most protected routes available. The wind had reached velocities that made standing upright difficult even for adults, while the combination of sleet and snow had transformed familiar trails into treacherous obstacle courses where a single misstep could result in a fatal fall down invisible precipices. Bear moved through this chaos with the fluid confidence of someone who had navigated such conditions countless times before, but even his expertise could not entirely eliminate the dangers posed by weather that seemed determined to test the limits of human endurance. He had fashioned a rope from materials in his pack, linking all three of them together to ensure that no one could become separated in the blinding precipitation. reduced visibility to mere feet in any direction. Lucy, despite her exhaustion from the ordeal in the mine, displayed remarkable resilience as they made their way along paths that would have challenged experienced mountaineers under ideal conditions. Her small stature actually proved advantageous in the severe wind, as she presented less surface area for the gusts to grab and destabilize. However, Emma could see that the child was drawing on reserves of strength that were rapidly approaching depletion, her movements becoming increasingly mechanical as she focused all her remaining energy on simply placing one foot in front of the other. The landscape they traversed had been transformed by the storm into something that belonged more to nightmare than to the familiar Colorado territory that Emma had come to know during her months in Cedar Falls. Trees that had stood for decades bent and swayed under the assault of the wind, their branches creating an ever-changing maze of obstacles that required constant vigilance to navigate safely. The sound of cracking timber echoed through the darkness like gunshots, warning of falling hazards that could appear without warning from any direction. Emma found herself developing a new appreciation for the skills that Bear had acquired during his years of mountain living. His ability to read the subtle signs that indicated safe passage versus dangerous terrain seemed almost supernatural in its accuracy, yet she understood that it represented nothing more mystical than the practical knowledge that came from daily exposure to an environment that tolerated no mistakes. Every choice he made about their route reflected an intimate understanding of how weather patterns affected specific geographic features, knowledge that could only have been gained through years of careful observation and occasional painful experience. The cabin, when it finally appeared through the driving snow, seemed to emerge from the mountain itself like something conjured by magic rather than built by human hands. Bear had chosen his location with the eye of someone who understood both the practical requirements of mountain shelter and the psychological need for a refuge that felt secure against the vast indifference of the wilderness. The structure was built into a natural depression that provided protection from the prevailing winds, while a grove of ancient pines created additional shelter, without blocking the southern exposure that would capture maximum sunlight during the brief mountain winter days. The building itself reflected the practical aesthetics of frontier construction, with walls made from massive logs that had been fitted together with the precision of a master craftsman. The roof, heavily reinforced to handle the weight of deep snow, extended well beyond the walls to create covered areas that could serve as storage space or work areas during inclement weather. Shutters protected the windows from storm damage, while allowing them to be open during fair weather to provide light and ventilation to the interior spaces. Emma's first impression upon entering the cabin was one of surprised comfort and unexpected refinement. The interior revealed a living space that was both functional and surprisingly sophisticated, with furnishings that demonstrated Bear's skills as a woodworker and his appreciation for the small details that transformed mere shelter into an actual home. Hand-carved furniture showed the influence of designs that Emma recognized from her Boston childhood, while shelves lined with books suggested intellectual interests that contradicted every stereotype about mountain hermits and their supposedly primitive lifestyle. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace that was already laid with seasoned firewood, ready to provide both warmth and light with the strike of a match. Bear moved to kindle the fire with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this ritual thousands of times, the flames quickly spreading through the carefully arranged tinder to create a blaze that began driving back both the physical cold and the psychological impact of their harrowing journey through the storm. Lucy collapsed into a chair near the fireplace with obvious relief, her small body finally able to relax after hours of sustained effort against conditions that would have exhausted adults twice her size. Emma helped the child remove her wet outer garments, hanging them near the fire to dry while checking for any signs of injury or frostbite that might require immediate attention. Fortunately, Bear's guidance had kept them moving quickly enough to prevent serious exposure, though Lucy's hands and feet showed the redness that indicated they had been dangerously close to frostbite during the worst portions of their journey. "There's dry clothing in the chest by the window," Bear told Emma, gesturing toward a piece of furniture that appeared to have been crafted from the same high-quality materials as the rest of the cabin's appointments. "Nothing that will fit either of you perfectly, but warm and clean clothes will help prevent illness while your own things dry out." Emma opened the chest to find garments that were clearly intended for a variety of situations and body types, suggesting that Bear had anticipated the possibility of providing emergency shelter for travelers caught by mountain weather. The clothing was well made and carefully maintained, with repairs that showed the neat handiwork of someone who took pride in keeping his possessions in good condition. She selected appropriate items for both herself and Lucy, grateful for the opportunity to change out of garments that had become thoroughly soaked during their trek through the storm. While they changed into dry clothes, Bear busied himself with preparations for what was clearly going to be an extended stay. He moved through the cabin with the automatic efficiency of someone following routines that had been developed and refined over years of solitary living, checking supplies, adjusting ventilation, and making the small adjustments necessary to accommodate 3 people in a space designed primarily for 1. His movements showed none of the awkwardness that might have been expected from someone who rarely entertained guests, suggesting that hospitality came naturally to him despite his chosen lifestyle. The cabin's interior revealed details that painted a complex picture of Bear's character and background. Medical instruments arranged on a shelf near the window indicated that he had maintained his skills as a healer despite his withdrawal from society, while a collection of carefully tended plants growing in containers near the southern exposure suggested knowledge of herbal medicine that complemented his formal training. Books on subjects ranging from botany to philosophy lined shelves that had been built with the same attention to detail that characterized the rest of the cabin's construction. "You're a doctor," Emma said, the realization dawning as she observed the medical supplies and the systematic organization that characterized someone trained in scientific methodology. Not just an army medic, but someone with formal medical education. Bear paused in his preparations to look at her with an expression that mixed surprise with something that might have been relief. "Harvard Medical School, class of 1859. Confirmed, his voice carrying a note of pride that had been absent when he spoke of his military service. "I had planned to establish a practice in Boston after the war, but 4 years of battlefield medicine changed my perspective on what constituted healing and what constituted harm." The revelation added another layer to Emma's understanding of the man, whom the townspeople of Cedar Falls had characterized as a dangerous savage. Dr. Daniel Morrison was not only educated and skilled, but represented exactly the kind of medical expertise that their isolated community desperately needed, yet was too prejudiced to accept. His withdrawal from society had deprived both himself and others of the opportunity to benefit from abilities that could have saved lives and reduced suffering throughout the territory. "Why haven't you told anyone?" Emma asked, though she suspected. She already knew the answer. "Dr. Pierce is elderly and overwhelmed. The town needs medical care that you could provide better than anyone else in the territory." Bear's expression darkened with memories that Emma could only imagine. "Because I learned during the war that people are more interested in placing blame than in accepting help from sources they consider inappropriate," he replied quietly. "I treated Confederate prisoners with the same care I gave to Union soldiers. And that made me suspect in the eyes of people who believed that mercy should be conditional on political loyalty. When I came west, I decided it was better to help quietly than to fight constantly for the right to practice medicine according to my conscience rather than popular opinion." The explanation revealed the depth of principle that had motivated Bear's decision to retreat from society rather than compromise his values to gain acceptance. His choice to live as a hermit represented not misanthropy, but a refusal to participate in systems that demanded he choose between effectiveness and approval. Emma understood the appeal of such an approach, having faced her own version of pressure to conform to expectations that conflicted with her beliefs about education and equality. Lucy, who had been listening to this exchange while warming herself by the fire, looked up at Bear with the direct gaze that characterized her approach to adult conversations. "You helped Confederate soldiers even though they were enemies?" she asked, her tone suggesting curiosity rather than criticism. "They were wounded human beings who needed medical care," Bear replied simply. "War makes enemies out of people who might otherwise be friends, but injury and illness don't recognize political boundaries. A doctor's duty is to heal whoever needs healing, regardless of the uniform they wear or the cause they serve." The child nodded thoughtfully, apparently finding this explanation both logical and morally satisfying. "That's like Miss Sullivan treating me the same as the other children, even though some people don't think Chinese children should get the same education as white children," she observed with the clarity that often made her insights more profound than those of adults. Emma felt a warm surge of pride at Lucy's comparison, recognizing that the child had identified the fundamental principle that connected Bear's medical philosophy with her own educational approach. Both of them had chosen to act according to their convictions about human dignity rather than bow to social pressures that demanded they treat people differently based on characteristics that had nothing to do with their need for help or their potential for achievement. Bear began preparing a simple meal from supplies that showed the same careful planning and quality selection that characterized every other aspect of his mountain lifestyle. The food was basic but nourishing, designed to provide the nutrition necessary for survival in challenging conditions, without requiring elaborate preparation techniques that might be impossible during emergencies. Emma watched him work, noting the efficiency and cleanliness that reflected his medical training as well as the practical experience of someone who had learned to live entirely by his own efforts. As they shared the meal in the warmth and security of the cabin, Emma found herself reflecting on the series of misconceptions and missed opportunities that had kept Bear isolated from the community that could have benefited so greatly from his presence. The townspeople's fear of him was based entirely on speculation and prejudice, while his own reluctance to engage with society stemmed from past experiences that had taught him to expect rejection and hostility, rather than acceptance and gratitude. "How often do you come down to town?" Emma asked, curious about the extent of Bear's contact with the community that had chosen to fear rather than welcome him. "3 or 4 times a year for supplies I can't make or find myself," Bear replied. "I try to conduct my business quickly and quietly to avoid creating problems for anyone. Most people seem more comfortable when they can pretend I don't exist, rather than having to decide whether I represent a threat that needs to be addressed." The lonely practicality of this arrangement struck Emma as profoundly sad, representing a waste of human potential that benefited no one while depriving everyone of opportunities for mutual assistance and understanding. Bear's skills as a physician, his knowledge of the mountain environment, and his obvious capacity for compassion were being squandered because fear and ignorance had convinced both sides that interaction was more dangerous than beneficial. "What about medical emergencies?" Emma pressed, thinking of the various injuries and illnesses that had plagued Cedar Falls during her months in the community. "Surely people must need help that Dr. Pierce can't provide." Bear's expression grew darker as he considered her question. "I've helped when I could do so without revealing my involvement," he admitted. "Anonymous supplies left where they would be found, treatments suggested through intermediaries who could claim credit for the recommendations, that sort of thing. But direct intervention would raise questions that the community isn't ready to answer." Emma began to understand the extent of Bear's anonymous contributions to the welfare of people who simultaneously feared and benefited from his presence. His protective watching over her own property, was probably just one example of assistance that he provided regularly without seeking recognition or gratitude. The irony of the situation was that the townspeople's safety and well-being had been enhanced by the very person they considered their greatest potential threat. Lucy, who had been growing increasingly drowsy as the warmth of the cabin and the stress of the day took their toll, looked up from her position curled in the chair nearest the fireplace. "Will Papa be worried about me?" she asked the question, reflecting both her concern for her father's feelings and her growing awareness that their overnight absence would create problems that extended beyond simple relief at her safe recovery. "Your father will be worried sick," Emma replied honestly, recognizing that Lin Chun's anguish would be compounded by his exclusion from the official search efforts and his knowledge that his daughter was somewhere in the mountains during the worst storm of the season. "But he'll also understand that staying here tonight was the safest choice under the circumstances." Bear stood and moved to one of the cabin's windows, peering out through the shutters at conditions that showed no signs of improvement. "The storm is getting worse instead of better," he reported grimly. "Even if we wanted to attempt a return journey tonight, it would be suicide in these conditions. We'll have to wait for daylight and hope the weather moderates enough to make travel possible." The news confirmed what Emma had already suspected about their situation, but hearing it stated explicitly brought home the social complications they would face when they finally returned to Cedar Falls, spending the night in the cabin of the man the townspeople considered dangerous would provide ammunition for anyone who wanted to question her judgment or her moral character. Mayor Caldwell and his supporters would undoubtedly interpret the situation in the most negative possible light, regardless of the circumstances that had made such an arrangement necessary for survival. However, as Emma looked around the comfortable cabin where they had found safety from conditions that could have killed all three of them, she realized that social consequences seemed far less important than the simple fact that they were alive and warm when they might otherwise have been freezing to death somewhere on the mountain. Bear's decision to offer shelter represented exactly the kind of selfless assistance that should have earned him gratitude rather than suspicion from the community he was helping to protect. "I know this creates problems for both of you," Bear said quietly, apparently reading the concern in Emma's expression. "If there's a way to minimize the social complications when we return to town, I'm willing to adapt our story to protect your reputations." The offer was generous and practical, but Emma found herself rejecting the idea of concealing the truth about their rescue and shelter. Bear's actions had been heroic in the most literal sense, risking his own safety to save a child whose life was in danger and providing essential assistance that no one else in the community could have offered. To deny him credit for these actions in order to protect herself from social criticism would be both dishonest and cowardly. "We tell the truth," Emma said firmly, her decision crystallizing as she spoke. "Lucy was lost in the storm. You helped us find her, and we sheltered here because attempting to return to town would have been dangerous for everyone involved. If people choose to find scandal in actions that saved a child's life, then their judgment says more about them than it does about us." Bear's scarred features showed surprise at her willingness to face potential social consequences rather than participate in a deception that would protect them both. "You understand what this might mean for your position in the community," he sighed, his tone suggesting that he was offering her one final opportunity to reconsider her decision. "I understand that some things are more important than social approval," Emma replied, looking at Lucy's sleeping form curled peacefully in the chair by the fire. "That child's life was worth any risk, and your help made her rescue possible. I won't dishonor that by pretending it didn't happen, or by allowing you to remain under suspicion for actions that demonstrated exactly the opposite of what people believe about your character." The conversation was interrupted by a tremendous crash from outside the cabin, followed by the sound of splintering wood and falling debris. Bear moved quickly to the window, looking out into the storm before turning back to them with an expression of grim concern. Large pine came down across the main trail about 50 yards from here, he reported. Even when the weather clears, it's going to take significant work to clear a passage large enough for safe travel. We may be here longer than anticipated. Emma absorbed this news with mixed feelings of disappointment and resignation. The longer their absence from town extended, the more difficult it would become to explain their situation in terms that the community would find acceptable. However, the reality of their circumstances left no room for wishful thinking or social considerations that ignored practical necessities. How long? Emma asked, though she suspected the answer would not be encouraging. Bear considered the question while mentally calculating the work required to clear the fallen tree and the time needed for trail conditions to improve enough for safe passage. Probably not before late tomorrow afternoon, assuming the storm ends by morning and we can get started on the clearing work early, he replied. Possibly longer if we encounter other blocked routes or if the weather doesn't cooperate. The prospect of spending not just one night, but potentially 2 days in Bear's cabin would escalate the social implications of their situation far beyond anything that could be easily explained or readily forgiven by the more conservative members of the Cedar Falls community. Emma realized that her decision to tell the truth about their rescue would now be tested under much more challenging circumstances than she had originally anticipated. However, as she looked around the warm, secure cabin where Lucy was sleeping safely instead of freezing to death somewhere in the mountains, Emma knew that her priorities remained clear. Whatever social consequences awaited them in Cedar Falls, they were preferable to the alternative of 3 people dying in a storm because they had prioritized reputation over survival. Bear seemed to understand her thoughts without need for verbal communication. There's plenty of food and fuel to keep us comfortable for as long as necessary, he assured her. And when we do return to town, we'll return with a child who is alive and healthy because we made the right choices under difficult circumstances. The quiet confidence in his voice reminded Emma that they were not the first people to face criticism for actions that saved lives, nor would they be the last. Throughout history, progress had often been made by individuals who chose to do what was right rather than what was popular, accepting personal costs in order to benefit others who might never fully appreciate the sacrifices made on their behalf. As the storm continued to rage outside their shelter, Emma settled into a chair near the fire and began to plan for the challenging conversations that awaited them when they finally returned to civilization. The next few days would test not only her courage and convictions, but also the willingness of the Cedar Falls community to recognize truth when it challenged their comfortable assumptions about heroes and villains. The mountain man they had feared as dangerous had indeed proven to be exactly that, but dangerous only to the ignorance and prejudice that had kept the community from recognizing one of its greatest potential assets. Whether the townspeople would be wise enough to learn from this revelation remained to be seen, but Emma was determined to give them the opportunity to grow beyond their current limitations. In the meantime, she was content to share the warmth and safety of Bear's cabin while Lucy recovered from her ordeal, and they all waited for conditions that would allow their return to a world that suddenly seemed far less important than the simple human connections they had forged during their time of crisis in the mountains. The dawn that broke over Mountain Pine Ridge 2 days later revealed a landscape transformed by the storm into something that belonged more to Arctic wilderness than to the Colorado territory that Emma had come to know. Snow had accumulated to depths that buried familiar landmarks beneath uniform white expanses, while ice coated every surface with a crystalline shell that reflected the morning sun like thousands of scattered diamonds. The beauty was breathtaking and treacherous in equal measure, promising both spectacular views and deadly hazards for anyone attempting to navigate the changed terrain. Bear had risen before sunrise to assess the conditions and begin the work of clearing the fallen pine that blocked their primary route back to Cedar Falls. Emma watched through the cabin, window as he methodically attacked the massive trunk with an axe, his movements showing the steady rhythm of someone who understood that such tasks required patience and persistence rather than explosive bursts of energy that would lead to exhaustion before the job was complete. Lucy had recovered completely from her ordeal in the mine, her natural resilience asserting itself once she had access to adequate food, warmth, and rest. She spent the morning helping Emma prepare a substantial breakfast while maintaining a steady stream of questions about Bear's medical training, his war experiences, and his reasons for choosing mountain solitude over urban practice. Her curiosity was both flattering and challenging, forcing Bear to articulate thoughts and feelings that he had kept private for years. "Why didn't you go back to Boston after the war ended?" Lucy asked with the directness that characterized all her interactions with adults. "If you were educated at Harvard, you could have had a successful practice treating wealthy patients instead of living alone in the mountains." Bear paused in his work to consider the question, his expression reflecting the complexity of emotions that surrounded his post-war decisions. "Success in Boston would have required me to pretend that my war experiences hadn't changed my understanding of what medicine should accomplish," he replied carefully. "I could no longer believe that healing should be reserved for those who could afford to pay premium prices while others suffered from conditions that proper care could easily remedy." Emma found herself deeply moved by this explanation, recognizing in Bear's words the same idealistic commitment that had driven her own decision to teach in frontier schools rather than seek more comfortable positions in established Eastern academies. Both of them had chosen principle over prosperity, except in isolation and criticism rather than compromise values that defined their sense of purpose and identity. The sound of approaching horses penetrated the mountain stillness around mid-morning, causing all three occupants of the cabin to freeze in recognition that their period of peaceful isolation was about to end. Bear set down his axe and moved to a position where he could observe the approaching party without immediately revealing his own presence, while Emma prepared herself mentally for confrontations that were certain to be both intense and potentially damaging to her future in Cedar Falls. The rescue party that emerged from the tree line consisted of 12 men led by Sheriff Henry Walsh, whose grim expression suggested that he viewed their mission as something more serious than a simple search for missing persons. Mayor Robert Caldwell rode beside the sheriff, his presence indicating that political considerations had elevated the situation beyond routine law enforcement into the realm of community judgment and social control. Lin Chun was notably absent from the group, confirming Emma's suspicion that the Chinese father had been excluded from efforts to locate his own daughter based on prejudices that prioritized social comfort over practical effectiveness. The injustice of this exclusion struck Emma as particularly cruel, given that Lin's intimate knowledge of the mountain terrain and his powerful motivation to find Lucy could have made him the most valuable member of any search party. Dr. Franklin Pierce rode near the rear of the group, his medical bag suggesting that the searchers had prepared for the possibility of finding injured survivors rather than simply recovering bodies. However, his position in the formation and his obvious discomfort on horseback indicated that his inclusion was more ceremonial than practical, designed to provide medical legitimacy for whatever actions the group might choose to take. Bear emerged from the tree line as the party approached the cabin, his massive frame and confident bearing immediately drawing the attention of every man in the group. Several hands moved instinctively toward weapons before training and discipline reasserted control. But the tension remained palpable as two worldviews prepared to collide in circumstances that neither side had anticipated or desired. "Sheriff Walsh," Bear said with calm formality, his voice carrying no trace of either deference or challenge as he acknowledged the law enforcement officer's authority. "I assume you're here about the missing child. She's safe and recovering inside the cabin." Walsh's relief at learning that Lucy was alive was immediately overshadowed by suspicion about the circumstances that had brought her into Bear's custody. His hand remained near his sidearm as he studied the mountain man with the calculating gaze of someone trying to determine whether he was facing a rescue situation or a criminal investigation. "Where's the schoolteacher?" Walsh demanded, his tone suggesting that Emma's welfare was as much a concern as Lucy's. "Martha Jenkins said Miss Sullivan went up into the mountains during the storm looking for help. Miss Sullivan is also inside the cabin, unharmed and resting after a difficult few days," Bear replied with the same measured calm he had shown throughout the exchange. "Both she and the child would have died in the storm if they had attempted to return to town under the conditions we faced." Mayor Caldwell urged his horse forward, his political instincts recognizing an opportunity to advance his agenda regarding undesirable elements in the community. "Dr. Morrison," he said, using Bear's title with a sarcasm that was clearly intended to question both his credentials and his right to practice medicine. "How convenient that you happened to be available when a child went missing. Almost as if you knew she would need rescuing." The implication was clear and deeply offensive, suggesting that Bear had somehow orchestrated Lucy's disappearance in order to position himself as her savior. Emma, who had been listening to this exchange from inside the cabin, felt her anger rising at the casual cruelty of an accusation that transformed heroism into conspiracy through nothing more than prejudice and political calculation. She emerged from the cabin with Lucy beside her, both of them clearly healthy and unharmed despite their ordeal. Lucy immediately ran toward the group of men, her face lighting up with relief and excitement as she recognized several familiar faces among the searchers. "Sheriff Walsh!" Lucy called out with the enthusiasm of a child who had missed human company during their mountain isolation. "Mr. Bear saved my life when I got trapped in the old mine, and Miss Sullivan climbed all the way up the mountain in the storm to find help. They're both heroes." The child's obvious affection for both Emma and Bear, combined with her clear testimony about the rescue, should have ended any questions about the nature of their relationship or the circumstances that had brought them together. However, Emma could see in Mayor Caldwell's expression that he was not prepared to abandon his narrative simply because it conflicted with inconvenient facts. "Little girl," Caldwell said, with the patronizing tone that adults often used when dismissing children's testimony. "Sometimes people who seem helpful are actually dangerous in ways that children can't understand. Are you certain that this man didn't hurt you or frighten you in any way?" Lucy's response displayed the intelligence and strength of character that had made her Emma's most remarkable student. "Mr. Bear is a doctor who went to Harvard Medical School," she replied with the precision of someone reciting carefully learned facts. "He saved my life when rocks fell in the mine, and he took care of both Miss Sullivan and me when the storm was too dangerous for traveling. If that's what dangerous people do, then I think more people should be dangerous." The logic of this response was unassailable, but Emma recognized that logic had never been the driving force behind the community's fear of Bear. Their prejudices were rooted in assumptions about appearance, lifestyle, and social conformity that were immune to evidence or rational argument. Dr. Pierce dismounted with obvious difficulty and made his way toward Bear with the uncertain gait of someone whose professional curiosity was stronger than his social caution. "Daniel," he said, using Bear's first name with the familiarity of someone who remembered him from before his retreat to the mountains. "It's been years since we've spoken. I had heard rumors that you were living up here, but I wasn't certain they were true." The acknowledgement that Dr. Pierce knew Bear personally added a new dimension to the confrontation, suggesting relationships and history that complicated the simple narrative of dangerous hermit versus concerned community. Emma realized that Bear's isolation might have been as much a choice respected by those who knew him best as it was a rejection imposed by those who feared what they didn't understand. "Franklin," Bear replied with genuine warmth, his formal demeanor softening as he greeted someone who represented positive memories from his past. "I've maintained my practice, just in a different setting and with different patients. The mountains have taught me things about healing that medical school never covered." Sheriff Walsh interrupted this reunion with the impatience of someone who wanted to resolve the situation according to predetermined conclusions rather than allow it to develop in directions he couldn't control. "Dr. Morrison, you'll need to accompany us back to town for questioning about the circumstances surrounding this incident. There are concerns about your involvement that need to be addressed officially." Emma felt her heart sink as she realized that Walsh was preparing to treat Bear's heroic actions as potential crimes requiring investigation. The injustice of this approach was staggering, but it reflected the community's determination to maintain its comfortable prejudices rather than confront evidence that challenged their fundamental assumptions about good and evil. "On what charges?" Emma demanded, stepping forward with an authority that surprised everyone present, including herself. Dr. Morrison risked his own safety to save a child's life and provided essential assistance that none of you were capable of offering. If you arrest him for acts of heroism, you'll be demonstrating exactly the kind of judgment that drives good people away from communities that desperately need their help. Her defense of Bear was passionate and public, making it impossible for anyone present to miss her position on his character and actions. Emma understood that she was crossing a line that would make her a target for the same suspicions, accusations that had been directed at Bear. But she also knew that remaining silent would be a betrayal of everything she claimed to believe about justice and courage. Mayor Caldwell's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he recognized that Emma had provided him with exactly the ammunition he needed to remove both troublesome elements from his community with a single stroke. "Miss Sullivan," he said with false sympathy, "it's clear that your judgment has been compromised by your ordeal, and perhaps by other influences that we don't fully understand. We'll need to conduct a thorough investigation before determining whether you remain suitable for your teaching position." The threat was direct and unambiguous, but Emma found that it carried less power to intimidate than Caldwell had probably expected. Her experiences during the past few days had clarified her priorities in ways that made social consequences seem less important than moral imperatives. "Mr. Mayor," she replied with dignity that commanded attention despite her unconventional appearance after days in the mountains, "my judgment led me to save a child's life with the assistance of the most competent and compassionate person available to help. If the community considers that unsuitable behavior for a teacher, then perhaps the community standards need examination rather than my actions." Dr. Pierce stepped forward with the authority that came from being the only person present who possessed both medical training and first-hand knowledge of Bear's capabilities. "Gentlemen," he said with the firm tone he had developed during decades of dealing with difficult patients and unreasonable family members, "I've examined both Miss Sullivan and Lucy Chen, and I can confirm that they received excellent medical care during their time away from town. Dr. Morrison's treatment of their exposure and exhaustion was both appropriate and effective." This professional endorsement from the community's established medical authority should have ended questions about Bear's competence and intentions, but Emma could see that Mayor Caldwell was not prepared to abandon his campaign simply because facts contradicted his narrative. Lin Chun appeared at the edge of the clearing, having apparently followed the search party despite being officially excluded from their efforts. His face showed the complex mixture of relief, gratitude, and anger that characterized a father who had found his child safe while being denied the opportunity to participate in her rescue. "My daughter," he said simply, his limited English carrying more emotional weight than elaborate speeches could have conveyed. "Is she hurt?" Lucy ran to her father with the uncomplicated joy of a child reunited with the person who represented safety and love in her world. Their embrace was witnessed by everyone present, creating a moment of pure human emotion that transcended the political complications surrounding their situation. "Papa," Lucy said in English that was clearly intended for the benefit of the assembled men. "Miss Sullivan came into the storm to find me, and Dr. Bear helped us both survive when we couldn't get home safely. They saved my life, and now some people want to punish them for being heroes." The child's summary of events was accurate and damning, highlighting the absurdity of treating rescue as a crime while excluding the grateful father from the investigation of his daughter's disappearance. Even the most prejudiced members of the search party seemed uncomfortable with the obvious injustices involved in their approach to the situation. Bear broke the uncomfortable silence that followed Lucy's statement by addressing the group with the calm authority of someone who had nothing to hide and no apologies to make for actions taken in good conscience. "Gentlemen," he said clearly, "I understand that my lifestyle choices have made me an object of suspicion in your community. However, when a child's life was in danger, those concerns became irrelevant. I would make the same choices again under similar circumstances, regardless of the consequences." The quiet dignity of this statement had a profound effect on several members of the search party, who seemed to be reconsidering their assumptions about the mountain man's character and motivations. Emma could see doubt beginning to replace certainty in faces that had arrived determined to find evidence of wrongdoing rather than heroism. Sheriff Walsh found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to choose between his loyalty to Mayor Caldwell's political agenda and his professional responsibility to base law enforcement decisions on evidence rather than speculation. The testimony of all involved parties supported the same conclusion. Bear's actions had been heroic and essential, while any criticism of his behavior was based on prejudice rather than facts. "Dr. Morrison," Walsh said finally, his tone suggesting internal struggle between duty and common sense, "I'll need detailed statements from everyone involved, but it appears that no crimes were committed and that your actions were both appropriate and necessary under the circumstances." Mayor Caldwell's face darkened with fury as he realized that his hoped-for opportunity to remove undesirable elements from the community was slipping away due to inconvenient realities. "Sheriff," he said with the cold authority of someone accustomed to having his wishes treated as commands, "I believe a more thorough investigation is warranted. The circumstances surrounding this incident raise questions that deserve careful examination." Dr. Pierce stepped forward again, his medical authority lending weight to his words as he addressed the political leader who was attempting to criminalize life-saving actions. "Mr. Mayor," he said with the firmness that came from decades of dealing with unreasonable demands, "as the senior medical professional in this community, I can state unequivocally that Dr. Morrison's actions were not only appropriate but exemplary. Any investigation that treats medical heroism as potential criminality will reflect poorly on our community's judgment and values." The support from Dr. Pierce represented a significant shift in the political dynamics of the confrontation, providing Bear with an ally whose professional standing and community connections made him difficult to dismiss or ignore. Emma realized that the tide of opinion was beginning to turn as more people recognized the absurdity of punishing someone for actions that had saved a child's life. Lin Chun stepped forward with the quiet dignity that characterized his approach to dealing with prejudice and injustice. "Dr. Morrison," he said in careful English, "my family owes you debt that cannot be repaid. You risked safety to save my daughter. This is honor, not crime." The grateful father's simple statement carried more moral authority than all of Mayor Caldwell's political maneuvering, highlighting the fundamental human decency that transcended cultural boundaries and social prejudices. Even the most hardened members of the search party seemed moved by Lin's obvious sincerity and gratitude. Bear acknowledged the thanks with a slight nod, his expression showing both appreciation for the recognition and discomfort with being the center of so much attention. "Mr. Chun," he replied formally, "your daughter is a remarkable young woman who survived her ordeal through intelligence and courage. I was fortunate to be able to assist, but her own strength was the most important factor in her survival. Emma watched this exchange with growing admiration for Bear's character, recognizing his instinctive deflection of praise toward the actual victim as evidence of the humility and wisdom that made him such an exceptional person. His refusal to claim credit for Lucy's survival demonstrated the same selflessness that had motivated his anonymous protection of Emma's property during the previous months. Mayor Caldwell made one final attempt to salvage his position and advance his agenda. Regardless of the outcome of this particular incident, he announced with the pompous authority that he used to disguise weakness as strength, "The school board will need to review Miss Sullivan's fitness to continue in her teaching position. Her judgment in seeking assistance from questionable sources raises concerns about her ability to provide appropriate guidance to impressionable children." The attack on Emma's professional standing was exactly what she had expected, but it still carried the sting of injustice and ingratitude that made her angry rather than afraid. She had saved a child's life through courage and good judgment, yet was being criticized for the very decisions that had made that rescue possible. Lucy Chen stepped forward with the fearless determination that had made her such a remarkable student, her small frame radiating indignation as she prepared to defend her teacher against criticism that she understood was both unfair and dangerous. "Mr. Mayor," she said with perfect diction that reflected Emma's careful instruction, "Miss Sullivan is the best teacher our school has ever had. She treats every student with respect and challenges us to achieve our potential regardless of our family background. If you remove her for saving my life, you'll be punishing someone for being exactly the kind of teacher that children need." The eloquent defense from an 8-year-old student carried more persuasive power than any adult testimony could have provided, demonstrating through Lucy's own abilities the success of Emma's educational approach. Several members of the search party seemed surprised by the child's sophisticated argument and obvious affection for her teacher. Dr. Pierce added his voice to Emma's defense with the authority that came from his position as the community's senior professional. "Miss Sullivan's actions demonstrate exactly the kind of judgment and courage that we should want in someone responsible for educating our children," he stated firmly. "Any attempt to punish her for saving a child's life would be a profound injustice. That would reflect poorly on our entire community." Bear stepped forward to add his own testimony to Emma's defense, his words carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed her character under the most challenging circumstances. "Miss Sullivan risked her own life to search for a missing child during dangerous weather conditions," he said clearly. "She demonstrated both physical courage and moral conviction that deserve recognition rather than criticism. Any community that punishes such actions will soon find itself without the kind of people who make civilization worth preserving." The combined testimonies from Dr. Pierce, Bear, Lin Chen, and Lucy herself created a powerful coalition that even Mayor Caldwell found difficult to dismiss or ignore. Emma realized that her decision to tell the truth about their rescue and shelter had indeed created the social complications she had anticipated, but it had also revealed sources of support that she hadn't known existed within the community. Sheriff Walsh, faced with overwhelming evidence that no crimes had been committed and growing pressure from respected community members to abandon his investigation, made the practical decision to conclude the matter in favor of common sense rather than political expedience. "Miss Sullivan," he said formally, "based on the testimony we've heard and the evidence of successful rescue, I see no grounds for further investigation of your actions. You and Dr. Morrison are free to return to your normal activities." Mayor Caldwell's expression showed his fury at being outmaneuvered by facts and testimony that contradicted his preferred narrative, but even his political authority had limits. When confronted by united opposition from the community's most respected members, his attempt to use the rescue as grounds for removing both Emma and Bear from the community had failed due to the inconvenient reality that their actions had been genuinely heroic. The journey back to Cedar Falls took place in an atmosphere of subdued reflection as everyone involved processed the implications of what they had witnessed and learned during the confrontation at Bear's cabin. Emma rode beside Dr. Pierce, who had insisted that she needed medical evaluation after her ordeal, while Lucy traveled with her father, their reunion creating a bubble of joy that seemed immune to the political tensions surrounding them. Had chosen to accompany the group partway down the mountain before disappearing back into the wilderness that had been his home for the past 8 years. However, his final words to Emma carried the promise of continued friendship and support that transcended the social barriers that had previously kept them apart. "Miss Sullivan," he had said with the formal courtesy that characterized all his interactions, "you have proven yourself to be exactly the kind of person that this community needs, even if it doesn't always recognize that need. If you ever require assistance or simply wish to continue our conversations about education and healing, you know where to find me." The offer of ongoing friendship from someone whose character and abilities she had come to respect deeply meant more to Emma than any official recognition or social approval could have provided. Bear's validation of her choices and his willingness to maintain their connection despite potential community disapproval gave her confidence that her decision to tell the truth had been correct regardless of its social consequences. The reception that awaited them in Cedar Falls proved to be more complex and nuanced than Emma had anticipated. While Mayor Caldwell and his closest supporters maintained their criticism of her judgment and their suspicion of Bear's motives, a significant portion of the community seemed genuinely grateful for Lucy's safe return and impressed by the courage that both Emma and Bear had demonstrated during the rescue operation. Martha Jenkins, who had initially supported the search efforts while harboring doubts about Emma's decision to seek Bear's assistance, approached her at the schoolhouse with an expression of sincere gratitude and respect. "Miss Sullivan," she said with the directness that characterized frontier women when acknowledging important truths, "I owe you an apology for doubting your judgment. What you did took more courage than most of us could have managed, and Lucy is alive because you were brave enough to seek help from the right person, regardless of what others might think." The acknowledgement from Martha, whose position at the center of the community's communication network gave her considerable influence over local opinion, represented a significant shift in social dynamics that would make Emma's continued presence in Cedar Falls more tenable despite Mayor Caldwell's continued opposition. Lin Chun's gratitude proved to be both deeply personal and publicly significant, as his obvious appreciation for Emma's efforts began to change how other community members viewed both her teaching methods and her judgment in crisis situations. His decision to present her with a beautifully crafted piece of Chinese artwork as a token of his family's eternal gratitude created a public demonstration of cross-cultural respect that challenged prevailing assumptions about the value of diversity and inclusion. Dr. Pierce's professional endorsement of both Emma's actions and Bear's medical competence opened discussions about healthcare resources that the community had been reluctant to consider previously. His suggestion that Bear's expertise could be valuable in treating the various medical emergencies that regularly occurred in frontier settings forced practical consideration of benefits that transcended social prejudices. The school board meeting that was convened to address Emma's fitness to continue teaching proved to be a forum for broader community reflection on values and priorities rather than the simple disciplinary proceeding that Mayor Caldwell had anticipated. Parents who had initially been skeptical of Emma's educational methods found themselves defending her character and abilities based on their children's obvious academic progress and their own observations of her dedication to all students regardless of family background. Lucy's own testimony to the school board about her teacher's courage, competence, and commitment provided the most compelling evidence of Emma's positive impact on the community's children. The child's eloquent defense of both Emma and Bear demonstrated Exactly the kind of critical thinking and moral reasoning that quality education was supposed to develop. The final decision to retain Emma as the community's teacher represented more than simple administrative action. It constituted a community choice to value courage and competence over conformity and prejudice. The margin of support was not overwhelming, but it was sufficient to validate Emma's belief that truth and justice could triumph over fear and ignorance when good people found the courage to stand for their convictions. Bear's transformation from feared hermit to respected community resource took place gradually over the months that followed their mountain rescue, as various medical emergencies and healthcare needs forced even his critics to acknowledge the value of his expertise. His establishment of a small clinic in town, operating under Dr. Pierce's supervision to satisfy legal requirements while providing services that the elderly physician could no longer deliver effectively, represented a victory for practical needs over social prejudices. The friendship that developed between Emma, Bear, and the Chen family became a symbol of the kind of community cooperation that could overcome artificial barriers based on fear and ignorance. Their regular gatherings for meals and conversation demonstrated that people of different backgrounds and experiences could find common ground in shared values of compassion, courage, and commitment to helping others. Emma's teaching career in Cedar Falls continued and flourished as parents began to recognize that her educational approach was producing students who were better prepared for the challenges of both academic learning and moral reasoning. Her willingness to defend her principles even at personal cost had earned her a respect that transcended the simple approval she might have received for conforming to community expectations. The legacy of their mountain rescue extended far beyond the immediate participants to influence community attitudes about judging others based on appearance, lifestyle choices, and cultural background rather than character and actions. While change came slowly and not everyone abandoned their prejudices, enough people learned from the experience to create a more inclusive and accepting environment for future generations. Years later, when Lucy Chen became the first Asian American student from Cedar Falls to attend college, her success was recognized as validation of educational approaches that valued individual potential over social conformity. Her gratitude to both Emma and Bear for their roles in her survival and development became part of community folklore that celebrated courage, compassion, and the willingness to challenge injustice. The mountain man who had been feared as dangerous proved to be exactly that, but dangerous only to ignorance, prejudice, and the comfortable assumptions that prevented communities from recognizing the heroes who walked among them. His example, along with Emma's courage and Lucy's resilience, demonstrated that true strength lay not in conforming to popular opinion, but in choosing to act according to conscience, regardless of social consequences. The storm that had brought them together had indeed been dangerous, but it had also been transformative, washing away misconceptions and revealing truths that changed lives and challenged a community to become better than it had previously imagined possible. In the end, the greatest danger had not been the mountain weather or the mysterious hermit, but the willingness to judge others without understanding and to value reputation over reality. The schoolhouse where Emma continued to teach became a symbol of the power of education to overcome prejudice and the importance of courage in defending what was right, regardless of popular opinion. The mountains where Bear had chosen to live remained a refuge for those seeking peace and healing. But they also became a reminder that true civilization was measured not by conformity, but by compassion. And high on Mountain Pine Ridge, the cabin where three unlikely friends had found shelter during a storm stood as testament to the truth that the most dangerous people in any community are often those who challenge others to be better than they ever thought possible. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.